Jacob, you had a very famous father, long-standing editor of the Times, and I wondered, did you never want to follow him down the journalism route? Were you always destined to be a politician?
Well, I never thought I was good enough at journalism, certainly not compared to my father, who was a brilliant and natural writer. And I've done a bit of writing, but I didn't think I was of his standard, and therefore it was better to pursue another career.
So you didn't want to be compared in a way?
My father was an enormously successful journalist, and to be compared to him would, from my point of view, always been very flattering. But no, I was attracted by doing something different.
But why politics?
Well, I could ask you the same, but particularly from your journalistic background and both your successful business career, successful journalistic career, what is the great draw of politics? Well, it's mixed things, isn't it? That there is an element of public service, that it is important to contribute to the society in which one's involved, but it's also compellingly interesting that you're involved in national events, you have a ringside seat at national events, sometimes you're directly involved with them, and it's very rewarding intellectually that you're dealing with interesting problems. So I think there are lots of reasons for wanting to be involved in politics.
So do you think your religious beliefs shape any of your political policies?
The question of religion and politics is a fascinating one, and the extent to which they interrelate and the extent to which they don't. Now, of course, most political decisions, most political issues, manifestos and so on, don't have a clearly religious element to them, do they? They are essentially secular. But I think the idea of public service is one that is certainly underpinned by religious belief and the value of everybody. I mean, lots of people think that you can't be a Christian and a Tory, that you have to be a socialist. And I've always thought that's absolute nonsense, because Christianity teaches very clearly that every individual is valuable, regardless of background. And the parable of the Good Samaritan is very important in this, that a reminder that however different people are, they are still loved by God, valuable individuals. And I think a political creed that is based on the individual is one that is very sympathetic to Christianity.
So when you saw people like the Archbishop of Glasgow come out and say the Rwanda policy for immigrants was morally wrong, did that cause you a bit of sort of inner tension, inner concern?
No, because I think there's very good medieval theology on this, when the papacy made great claims to have secular power as well as spiritual power. And there is a pope who in 1304, I think it is, puts out a papal bull, Unum Sanctum, claiming that all secular authority is subject to the church. And they base it on the doctrine of the two swords, that in St. Luke's Gospel, Christ is told there are two swords, that one is enough. And the argument was that the secular sword was delegated to the secular authorities and both belonged to the religious authorities. Now, this simply turned out not to be the case. And it became clearly established that the secular authority had the right of operating in its sphere. Render unto Caesar what is to Caesar, render unto God what is to God. And the highly elaborate claims by the papacy to have control over the secular world were debunked, for want of a better term. So I think morality is with the church, the teaching around the Gospels and matters of faith and morals. But day-to-day political decision-making is for the politicians, and that Rwanda is a political decision, not a moral one. And the lessons we've had on morality from various church figures have, to my mind, not actually understood the policy, so they haven't been relevant to the fundamental policy.
But you never took it personally?
No, right, certainly not. If I have responsibility to a bishop, it's to the Bishop of Clifton, who is the bishop in Somerset, who I always listen to very carefully. The Archbishop of Glasgow is not in any direct line a spiritual authority to people living in Somerset.
And how does your family view you as a sort of a famous and much sort of watched politician? How do they cope?
Well, a bit of a mix, inevitably, that I think my children enjoy it most of the time. They get a bit fed up with me when they can't get a word in edgeways because I'm talking to other people. And I once went to the Royal Bath and West show, and one of my children said to me, "Daddy, the next time I come with you to anything like this, you must come in disguise, because he got so fed up with me speaking to people. But it was about...
I don't think you'd be easily disguised, to be fair. And your children, who look a lot like you, would all have to come in disguise as well.
But it was about 3 weeks before the Brexit referendum. So that sort of explained why people wanted to have a conversation. And then they see that actually it's quite interesting.
And you've got to share a lot of time around your 6 children as well, so they've got to share it out between them. How about Peter? Is he going to follow in your footsteps and become an MP?
I don't know. I mean, his great passion at the moment is cricket.
Quite right too.
Quite right too. But my daughter Mary's getting increasingly interested in politics. She came with me earlier this week to Bristol, where I was doing one of the events for Liz Truss. We were debating against Mark Harper. And Mary came along and found it absolutely fascinating. So there may be some competition in the Rees-Mogg household for who is going to be the political figure after me.
And maybe female leaders draw on a female audience as well, like Margaret Thatcher did.
Now, when did you first decide that you wanted Boris to be Prime Minister?
I thought he was by far and away the best candidate in 2016. And I was going to support him then, had his campaign continued. And I would have carried on supporting him. I switched to Michael Gove once Boris had decided not to go for it. And then we saw the difficulties that Theresa May got into. And it became absolutely clear to me that there was only one candidate who could possibly deliver for us and have the charisma and reach that Boris Johnson has, that successfully won the 2019 election, dealt with Brexit and so on. As long as there was a contest and he was a runner, he was somebody I was going to back.
How would you score his government and his time as Prime Minister out of 10?
I think his government has been extremely successful, even in the areas where I have been slightly more cautious. So if you take Brexit was delivered. And from the starting point he had with the deal that was on the table beforehand, that was really a brilliant success. During the pandemic, it may not surprise you to know, indeed we may even have discussed it at the time, I was very much in favour of a more liberal approach in allowing people to make decisions for themselves. Nonetheless, I think the PM got all the big choices right and did what he almost had to do. There was much less discretion over it than I think you or I would have liked, because if you're being told by all the senior advisors who are meant to know about this sort of thing that you will kill people if you don't have a lockdown, you're taking a huge risk in not having a lockdown. And obviously he got the decision over the vaccine right. But also interestingly, though this cost a lot of money, over getting the PPE supplies. You remember the panic there was to get these supplies, and actually the UK managed to deliver them. A lot of them produced domestically. I think we went from under 1% being produced domestically to 80% being produced domestically, excluding gloves, as it happens. And so he got the big decisions right. And then at Christmas, he was the one who decided that we would not close down again. And that was proved to be the right decision, because Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland did close down with no better result than we had in England. And all the advice was telling him not to from the experts. But he made the bold decision. He thought the British people could be trusted to make decisions for themselves. And that had a huge benefit economically and societally. So he got that right, and he got Ukraine right, which I think is one of the biggest foreign policy decisions of our lifetimes, possibly the biggest foreign policy decision since the Falklands. So really important things he's got right. The area where I think the government has not been so strong is on economic policy. But there's somebody else that I would blame for that.
So if I was to be critical of the Boris Johnson government and his record, I would say we had the lockdowns, which, you know, a socialist would have been proud of the restrictions on people's
They all
freedoms.
voted for it. They were that proud of it.
Absolutely. That we had the, as you've just alluded to, the highest burden of taxation probably on record, and he's the First Lord of the Treasury. We've had the banning of buy one, get one free offers that he brought forward, and all this sort of nanny state kind of stuff. We left the EU, as you said, but we still had the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is carved up the United Kingdom. So people might look at that and say, well, actually, that doesn't sound like a particularly strong record to me.
Well, I think if we talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol, we got Brexit done, and we're now dealing with the Northern Ireland Protocol. And that actually the one person who has been pushing that most strongly is Liz Truss. who, as everyone remembers, voted Remain and has shown herself to be somebody who can put Brexit into practice. I share your concern on the tax burden. I thought the national insurance increase was a mistake. I argued strongly against it. Actually, there was quite an amusing circumstance. After the cabinet that approved it, I went on to another meeting with the chief whip and suddenly realised I'd left my telephone outside the cabinet room, went back to get it, and then came out of Downing Street half an hour after everybody else, and I got a message from Sky News saying, was I being persuaded out of resigning? No, not at all. I just had left my telephone in the wrong place.
That's how front page stories start.
I thought that was a mistake, and I think conventional Treasury thinking has been consistently wrong. So for 2021-22, the Treasury thought the deficit would be £106 billion worse than it actually was. Tax revenues have come in ahead of expectations and some spending has been below. And we have had these increases in tax rates on the basis of wonky OBR forecasts. We then have this absolutely lunatic rise in corporation tax on the basis that hitting companies is free. Well, it isn't. If you put up corporation tax, companies that invest in the UK require a net margin. They will not invest without being able to achieve that net margin, or to achieve it, what do? They cap wage rises or they increase prices. So you add to inflationary problem, and there is this ridiculous idea in the Treasury that hitting big companies is free, doesn't hurt people. Of course it does. It hits the very consumers who are suffering from cost of living problem at the moment.
But why do you not blame Boris for these things? I mean, he's the Prime Minister. He's the First Lord of the Treasury. He's the person who's in charge of the government. Why do you excuse him from blame for those things?
Because I think you assume that the Prime Minister is a dictator, and he isn't. He's first among equals. And I know we tend to look at our elections in an increasingly presidential style, but the reality of cabinet government is that a vast swathe of decisions are made by ministers. And yes, the Prime Minister has the authority to overrule them, but the overrule is very unusual. And the Treasury is a particularly strong department that actually has the ability to block a lot of what other departments are doing.
I wanted to ask you something. I know you said 2016 is when you sort of got involved and you would have pursued the leadership further with Boris. When did you first meet him? Was it at school? Was it at university? Where was it?
No, neither of those. I think Boris and I first really got to know each other after a party conference.
I was going to say after a party.
Party conference. After I'd been selected for North East Somerset. And the two biggest gaff makers at the conference were one B. Johnson and J. Rees-Mogg, which you may think is true to form in both cases.
What were they? What were the gaffs?
I can't remember precisely what Boris had done, but I'd given an interview to Newsnight where I'd been disparaging about the A-list and the approach to Cameronisation of the Conservative Party.
That wasn't a gaff.
Well, I didn't think you would disagree.
But because people always say, oh, Eton, the school they went to is the school that, thinks it will rule the country. They invariably do. So I wonder, is the Eton blood thicker than any other kind of blood? Are your friendships tighter than anybody else's? No,
not at all. I think one's friendships that go back to school and university days are strong friendships. I think that's certainly true, and I think that's true for many people. But I think when I was at Eton, nobody thought that Eton would produce another Prime Minister. We thought the last one was Alec Douglas-Home, and that it was all rather marvellous that we had this political history, but that it was very unlikely that that would carry on.
Why was that? Why did you not think you'd have another one?
Well, I think we thought that society had changed and that therefore it was very unlikely that an Etonian would get into the position of winning a leadership contest. And then Douglas Hurd tried when John Major got it, and his campaign didn't go very well and concentrated a lot on the fact that he was an old Etonian.
Was that then Margaret Thatcher moving it on, do you think, went to the people rather than people who thought they were the ruling class?
Margaret Thatcher was a believer in meritocracy, and that, I think, doesn't promote or discriminate against old Etonians. I think the idea that you have first-class people who are good enough to do the job. But actually, I think with both David Cameron and Boris Johnson, And I wasn't ideologically close to David Cameron, but I think he had many virtues as a Prime Minister. I think he was a serious and substantial figure. And I think Boris Johnson is a remarkable political figure, one you get extremely rarely, with an extraordinary reach and charisma, an understanding of how the nation runs. And they both happened to be Old Etonians. I think it's more important the abilities they brought than where they were educated. Though I much prefer Boris Johnson's approach to it, because David Cameron always seemed rather apologetic about being an Old Etonian. And I don't think one should be, because Eton is a fantastic school. Any sensible education policy would want to make every school in the country as good as Eton, not to say, isn't it a pity we have this amazing world-beating school in this country.
What do you think then was Boris's demise?
Oh, there are all sorts of reasons. I think part of the reason has to be Brexit. There are still a lot of people who resent the fact we left the European Union, and therefore to bring down the standard bearer of Brexit was a triumph for them. And you had people like Lord Heseltine and Lord Davies saying no Boris, no Brexit. And I think they really thought that. And I very much hope it's not true, that I think we've taken a risk. The establishment of the Conservative Party, I mean, look where the Cameroon establishment are, other than Philip, actually, eccentrically. They're all with Rishi. So the Cameroon establishment never really warmed to Boris, for all sorts of reasons.
But the Thatcher supporters are also with Rishi, aren't they? He's got Howard, he's got Lawson, and Peter Lilly.
Michael Howard was a great backer of David Cameron.
Indeed, prepared him for
the leadership, and William Hague, who was obviously Cameron's foreign secretary for an extended period.
Lawson forcefully came.
Nigel Lawson. If only Rishi had been a Lawson-esque chancellor, we wouldn't be in the state that we're in today.
Now, Dominic Cummings. People might think the demise started there. Why did he employ him?
Because Dominic Cummings had been very successful, that he'd been a very important part of the referendum campaign. He seemed to be good at understanding the mood of the British people and campaigning on it, that his eccentricity seemed a price to be worth paying for his genius. And both of them are there. In the end, it turned out that his eccentricity was absurd and self-serving, and that he thought he was Prime Minister. And that was never going to work.
And then the other person people will question after the sort of the 2016 leadership that never happened was Michael Gove. Why did he bring Michael Gove in? People would say, crikey, the reports at the time, he was stabbed in the front and he never, managed to take the leadership at that time.
Well, Michael is a very able politician, a clever, interesting man.
And so he overlooked what might have been seen as this sort of backstabbing side because he thought he was an able politician.
I think all Prime Ministers have to appoint a range of people to their cabinets, and they need people who can run large departments. Michael had shown at education, where potentially Michael's the best education secretary in recent history. Kenneth Baker would be perhaps a contender for that title against him. But the two of them fundamentally reformed education for the better. After a number of education secretaries, including Margaret Thatcher, who closed a number of grammar schools, though it was very hard for her to refuse under the laws applying at the time. But those two were really transformative education secretaries. And having ministers who can run a department is something Prime Ministers don't necessarily have a huge supply of.
Does Boris really shoulder any responsibility for his demise?
Of course he does. People are always responsible for the things that they do themselves. That doesn't mean there are other people who weren't waiting there to catch them.
Listen, the world of politics, as you and I know, it is probably more complicated than anything else. I'm asking you these questions. But is Rishi to blame, really?
In what way?
That of his downfall, people will say, and you will be one of them, you're backing Liz Truss because Rishi did him a disservice, and that was part of the triggering and the downfall.
I don't particularly want to go into Mr. Sunak's personal behaviour. I think better to stick to his economic policy. And I think the Treasury orthodoxy has not been working and needed fundamental change. And I've been saying that consistently for some time. That isn't a thing that I've suddenly come out with. And I'd rather discuss the leadership in terms of the policies that I think need changing rather than individuals' behaviour, for better or worse.
Okay, fair point.
Are you supporting Liz Truss, or are you just supporting the person who isn't Rishi Sunak?
No, I'm supporting Liz positively because as long as I've known her back to 2010, I've known her a little before, but known her better since 2010, she has been a real free market conservative. She set up the free enterprise group of members of parliament to campaign for proper conservative economic policy. And therefore, I'm confident that she will challenge the Treasury orthodoxy to get an economic policy that's actually in favour of growth and understands that other things being equal is one of the great mistakes of policy making.
You see, it seems unlikely, doesn't it, really, that you'd be supporting Liz Truss, former Lib Dem, wanted the monarchy abolished, she supported Remain in the referendum, campaigned for Remain in the referendum, she backed Theresa May to the hilt and her deal all the way through to the hilt. It seems with that sort of background, it's an unlikely person for Jacob Rees-Mogg to be supporting.
Not necessarily. I have heard Liz say that you'd have to be pretty odd to hold the same beliefs and whatever her age now is as you held when you were 17. I hold exactly the same beliefs. So that's the one thing I do disagree with. My views have hardly changed at all, and I very much doubt yours have either. But actually, I think having somebody who understands that what they thought earlier in life isn't right, and particularly with the referendum, accepts enthusiastically what the British people gave her to deal with. And she's not alone in that. I've always thought the most impressive Remainers are the ones who, once the result came in, said, OK, that's it, I'm accepting it, and I want now to do it properly. And there are a number of those. There are quite a lot who say that and don't really mean it. But I found in government that Liz, other than the Prime Minister himself, was my greatest supporter for getting Brexit opportunities in the Cabinet Committee that she chaired, when other people who are now saying we should grasp the opportunities of Brexit were opposing them.
But she hasn't said that she accepts the result. She's gone further than that. She says that she got it wrong, that she should have supported Brexit. She got it wrong. And I just wonder, does somebody who got the biggest decision of our lifetime wrong, is that the person that we want to be the Prime Minister of our country? Well,
how often do you ever hear a politician say, I got that wrong, and admit it and say, look, I got it wrong and now I'm going to do better? I think that's brilliant. I think it's very refreshing. And she's enthusiastic about it. And that's terrific, because if we're to get the benefits of Brexit, we need enthusiasm. It's fascinating with retained EU law and getting rid of it. There is inevitable inertia, because it's a lot of work to do to transfer laws from the EU to us, to get rid of laws that we don't need. The Treasury wanted all tax law exempt from this process, so it would remain part of EU law, remain subject to the supremacy of EU law. Other departments were more or less enthusiastic. To his great credit, George Eustace was willing to take it on, even though DEFRA probably has more work to do than any other department. But that wasn't true of all departments. And so having somebody who's really keen to do it and will drive it through is fundamental.
But she's lucky there, isn't she? She's somebody who can say, I was wrong, and now can see the way forward. That's a positive for her. Most politicians in a job who say, I got it wrong, it will be viewed as a negative, because they've then got to dig out of what they've got wrong and redo something in policy.
Not really. I think that if you look at Theresa May's approach, who said, oh, I accept the result, and then did nothing about it, actually clearly thought the result was wrong all the way through her premiership, that didn't work. I think you need to accept that you're starting from scratch. And what she says she got wrong was that she believed what was coming out of the Treasury. And that's actually very helpful, because she's now very suspicious of the Treasury orthodoxy. Bear in mind, the Treasury said we'd have to have a panic budget if we dared to vote to leave the European Union on what would happen just because of a vote to leave, before a single change had been made in any of our laws. And there is a sort of absurdity about Treasury orthodoxy that Liz has seen through, and Rishi is part of. He was the Treasury orthodoxy man.
But, you know, Liz says that she's against lockdowns, she's against the nanny state things like the buy one, get one free stuff, she's against the tax rises. Is she just jumping on a bandwagon with these things, or did she argue against these things in government and nobody listened to her?
Most of the points, when they came up, if they came to the Cabinet, Liz and I were saying exactly the same thing. The other person who was broadly saying the same thing was David Frost.
And so have we reaped the benefits of Brexit?
Not yet, no. We've got much more to do. We've got some benefits already, and we saw that with vaccine rollout. We've seen it with some minor tax changes. We've seen it with the tentative beginnings of free ports. But there is a lot more that we can do. Solvency II could unleash tens of billions of pounds a year for investment in the economy. It's one of the biggest things we can do to boost the economy. There are other things we can do. We should get rid of all the tariffs on goods that we don't produce, which would be a help, not the biggest help, but a help to people in a cost of living crisis.
I was going to say, what do you think needs to be done to deliver those sort of Brexit bonuses?
There's the opportunity to take the 5% VAT off fuel, which we couldn't possibly do whilst we were in the European Union, but would be a help to every household.
Now, I've got to ask you about working from home and the civil servants and getting all this done, you know, after COVID, after Brexit. We all need to be there. Do civil servants need to be in 5 days a week? There is so much to be done.
Oh, but people need to be in the office and to do their jobs properly, particularly if the job isn't being done properly at the moment. So I think you can judge by results that there are some jobs that can be done perfectly well from home. If you're a novelist, you can probably work very well at home. I think P.G. Wodehouse, whom I'm a great admirer, worked extremely effectively at home.
Could your dad have worked from home?
Oh, and did. That when he was editing the Times, of course he couldn't. He had to be there physically. But as a columnist, you can work from home perfectly reasonably. But if you're providing somebody with a passport, you need to be in the office. You can't allow people to be sending passports out from home. I was talking to somebody who rang the passport helpline, and there was a child in the background, and the person on the helpline had to go off to look after the child. And the person had been on hold to get through for ages and ages. This just isn't good enough. It's not a proper way, and the helpline is outsourced anyway, but it's not a proper way to deliver public services. And I went yesterday morning to the government office in Canary Wharf. Really high-class offices, very expensive. And I went onto a floor, and I was told all the floors were the same. They have 400 desks on a floor, and I'd be surprised if there were 40 people working there. And people said, well, people are on leave. Well, they can't all be on leave. It's just not good enough. And people need to be back at work, and all the service needs to be perfect. If there were no problems with DVLA, with the passport office, with the probate office, then you say, okay, it's fine. But these services are not delivering what the British public have a right to demand, and we are paying people as if they were going into work. They get their London allowance, and yet they are not going into the office and the service isn't being delivered. I think this is really important. And the frustrating thing is, although the Cabinet has decided this, permanent secretaries have decided this, the message is not getting through properly, except in some very specific areas. I was very impressed in a visit to our office in Birmingham that Ofsted was fully occupied. So the head of Ofsted believes working from the office is essential to create the team spirit that you need and so on. And the offices her team had were full. There were other teams with acres of space and nobody there.
How are you going to get people? You know, you've done the letter. You know, you're not in, please come in. You've done the, get in. You've proved things aren't being done and we've got delays. What is it? What are we going to have to do?
It has to come down to line managers getting their people in and recognising that that is their contractual obligation. And we need to stop accepting excuses. So throughout the summer, there's been, since I started this, I was appointed in February, and I've been working on this since. So to begin with, it was the end of COVID restrictions. Then it was Easter. Then it was the Jubilee. Then there was a rail strike. Then it was hot. And nobody can do any work when it's hot, apparently, for 2 days in a century. And we all have to stay at home. And now, what's the excuse now? Oh, now it's August, so nobody can possibly... I mean, we're becoming French. Nobody being expected.
No, we're less productive, I believe, than France now. We are going to have to say we need to.
We need to see people. We need people be back in the office, and I mean, I think either of the potential leaders both committed to getting people back into work.
I think there was a tweet by one of the Sun journalists today who said, "Oh, this picture was just your office or something, Jacob, and that was the one you used." And I thought, well, I'm quite sure that would be the office you chose to take a photo of. I don't know.
No, it wasn't. The picture that I put on Twitter, I think it was given to me by another minister of somewhere in the Treasury office. My own office is much smaller than that, and the people who are in my private office is in and working very hard. But I could show you pictures of emptier offices than the one the Sun had.
Now, you're a very popular person with our members of the party and with the public, Jacob, so why did you not put your name forward for the leadership election?
Well, you're very kind. I'm not sure I am as popular as you're saying.
Oh, I'll back him up. You are.
Well, you're very kind. I thought that to get what I want to happen in government, to get the delivery of Brexit, to get a proper economic policy, people of my way of thinking needed to unite around a single candidate. And that single candidate was Liz Truss. That there are other people who I think very highly of. I'm a great admirer of Priti Patel, for instance. I think her efforts on immigration, which seem to be thwarted by what some people rather rudely call lefty lawyers, not a term I would of course dream of using, has done amazing work. But Priti didn't have the momentum. I think highly of Nadeem Zahawi, who I think is, in the short time he's been at Treasury trying to get to grips with it. But it seemed to me that Liz was much clearer in where she wanted to go, better positioned, and was the one person who could get momentum to win for what I think I can fairly say the three of us broadly believe in. But
you wouldn't rule out standing in the future for the post if the ball came from the back of the scrum, I think the phrase is?
I'm not a very good rugby player. So I don't think I would ever be on the rugby field.
But you're going to stay in politics. You're not going to. I hear all these people who are going to leave the House of Commons when Boris goes. People like Nadine and Nigel Adams. I keep hearing are going to other places. You're planning on staying in the.
Why would I leave?
Why would I leave? I hope you're going to stay. I just want to clarify that you're going to stay.
We had a lot of fun when I was on the back benches. I may be joining you again on Fridays to stop dreadful bills getting through.
You'll be very welcome.
Will Boris stay on as an MP?
I don't know. I haven't discussed it with him in any detail. That David Cameron went almost immediately, Tony Blair went absolutely immediately, Theresa May has stayed. It's a difficult decision to make, I think, because there's anything you say as a former PM who remains in Parliament is seen as being disagreeable, whereas if you don't say things, you're not representing your constituents. Boris has a very sunny character, and therefore it may be easier for him than it was, for example, for Ted Heath. But it is, as I said, it's a difficult choice, and I don't actually know what I would say to him if he asked for my view. I haven't come to a clear view as to what the right thing for him to do would be.
Because, people would say he's going to come back, he's going to be like Churchill, he'll want to be Prime Minister again. Does he want to be Prime Minister again? Did he think at any time he would come back and be Prime Minister again?
Nobody's come back having lost the leadership of the party since Gladstone. And I just don't think in modern politics the chance of coming back is realistic. Lots of people think they're going to be called back by a grateful nation, which is why Harold Macmillan waited 20 years before accepting his peerage, because he thought even in very advanced old age, the country would finally say, Harold, we need you back. Things have got so bad. Life just isn't like that.
Just a couple of final questions. The Privileges Committee investigation into Boris, what do you think of that as a witch hunt? Do you think it's perfectly proper that they investigate him?
I think it's quite extraordinary that Harriet Harman, who I think is a very distinguished political figure, has not recused herself from it after the tweets that she put out accusing the Prime Minister of lying. I do not believe you can have a fair judgment when the chairman of the committee has already judged the matter. And I think she should stand down. I'm astonished that she accepted it, because she is, if I may put it this way, a good socialist. She's a very respectable individual. She's admired across party. And I think she's doing genuine damage to her reputation by putting herself in this position.
So it's not the committee inquiry that you have a problem with?
I think the committee inquiry is absurd. The Prime Minister has gone.
And the final question is, you said a while back that you thought that if there was a new Prime Minister, there should be a general election. Is that still your view? Was it ever your? I mean, did you just say that as a way to threaten people, don't get rid of Boris because you may face a general election? What's your view now on that?
When I first said it this year, people said exactly that to me. You're only saying it's a threat. And the great virtue of Hansard is that you can look up your old speeches. I actually made this point in 2011 when we were discussing the Fixed Term Parliament Act. And I was saying that the Fixed Term Parliament Act was a mistake because the Constitution was evolving to the point where a new Prime Minister would feel under a very strong pressure to have a new election, and that Gordon Brown had made a mistake in not doing it. The question now is, where are we in that evolution? Because I think that is unquestionably the evolution. I think the mandate Prime Ministers have is very personal. We are not a presidential system, but the mandate of a Prime Minister is personal. We all know that our personal vote in our own constituencies is small. However long we've been there, how much we get on with our constituents, just look at how Dominic Grieve and David Gauke did, respected long-serving MPs up against the party. People vote for the party, not the individual. And the party according to its leader as much as anything else. So I think the personal nature of the mandate, the general evolution of our constitution meant that prior to the Fixed Term Parliament Act, it was becoming almost inevitable. I think the Fixed Term Parliament Act has delayed that to some extent, but I think the pressure is unquestionably still there.
So if Liz Truss becomes Prime Minister within the next month, will you advise her to call a general election?
It's one of those decisions that is very much a personal one for any Prime Minister. I don't think it's one where Prime Ministers expect to get advice anymore. Interestingly, it was a cabinet decision until early 20th century. I'll have to look up precisely when. And it was thought right that the Prime Minister should discuss it with the cabinet. But by, I think, the 1920s, so maybe a little bit earlier, it's become very clearly a uniquely prime ministerial decision as to when to advise the monarch for a dissolution.
I know you work tirelessly. I know you're not even getting a summer holiday. So what do you do to relax?
I find politics so interesting that I don't think that being involved in politics is in that sense, it's not my nose to the grindstone. And I've got 6 children who keep me entertained and busy. Last night, once it got cool enough, I was playing cricket with Thomas, who's my 12-year-old son. So there's lots to do with the family.
No more, though. No more of it.
Helena has said that, no, I think her line is no more septicemia or octopus. So I think Sixtus is where we've drawn stumps, much so I would like to have the full cricket team. But there are all sorts of things to do beyond politics as well.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you both very much.
Thank you very much indeed.